My name is Paul, and thank you so much for joining me as today we take a look through some of the lost railways in the county of Hertfordshire. Over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to be looking at specifically the sections of disused trackbed which have been converted into traffic-free pedestrian foot cycle paths, creating these beautiful green corridors through the Hertfordshire landscape. I'm going to be having a look at a brief history of the line, what railway infrastructure survives today, and as well as some general history of the surrounding area as well. So, by the mid-19th century, the main railway companies had largely crossed Hertfordshire, and so began the task of building the branch lines to join the smaller towns together. And between 1843 to 1877, Hertfordshire gained 8 branch lines. All of these are now lost, with the exception of Hertford East and St Albans Abbey. These branch lines served vital purposes of carrying passengers and goods, but by the early 20th century, when competition from the road transport and the overall nationalisation of the railway network came, it led to them closing down by 1964 to 1965. Partly because of the Beeching Report, a plan administered through the chairman of British Railways, Dr. Richard Beeching, which saw the closure of over 5,000 miles of track and over 2,000 stations across the country in an effort to ensure the continued survival of the railway network. So of the 6 which were lost, 5 of them have been preserved as public access routes. These are the Ware, Haddenham and Buntingford Railway, the Hertford and Welwyn Junction Railway, the Welwyn Garden City to Luton and Dunstable branch line, the Hatfield and St Alban Railway, the Harpenden to Hemel Hempstead Railway, and the Watford and Rickmansworth Railway. So I'm going to have to look through all 6, but only the first one, the Ware, Haddenham and Buntingford Railway, which today is known as the Bunt, is the only real exception in that it is not a publicly accessible route along its entire course. So I'm only going to be mentioning it rather briefly before moving on to, in more detail, the other lines. Now, the Bunt itself travels north to south as opposed to east to west like the other ones, and covers about 14 miles of track connecting St Margaret's in the south to Buntingford in the north. The line itself proved relatively to have a strong passenger service, but after the Second World War, with the rising costs of the railway infrastructure in the country, the line wasn't busy enough to justify its continuation and ultimately was closed down in 1964. Today, not much of that line really survives, unfortunately. Some parts of it are walkable, especially around Buntingford, where you might just about be able to see the actual railway building from the station, and some sections of trackbed are accessible. The most notable feature is at Braring Station, where you can go to, and they've rather nicely preserved the platforms, some trackbed, and there's even a car still in situ. If you want to visit this line, you really do need to have a car or just be willing to access it using the motorways that connect it. Braring Station itself, much like some of these other lines, was also featured in filming works during the 20th century. The station that exists today was used in the Dad's Army episode, The Battle Station, and the line was happy to feature films such as Happy Ever After in 1954 and Operation Bullshine in 1969, as well as Postman's Knock with Spike Milligan as well. It's well worth a trip if you're out that way, but I'm going to move on to the first line which has truly been converted into a public accessible route, and that is the Coal Greenway. Now, this really dates back as the Hertford and Welling Junction Railway and opened in 1858. And it's one of the earliest railway routes in Hertfordshire and was intended to join the Hertford, Luton and Dunstable branch at Welling Garden in the west and Hertford North in the east. Unfortunately, the Hertford, Luton and Dunstable Railway wouldn't allow its branch lines to cross tracks at either end, and ultimately this little branch line remained isolated with no through trains for its entire existence. Matters got worse when in the 1920s the Great Northern Railway built the Hertford Loop and a new station at Hertford North, which essentially cut off the eastern end of the branch completely. Passenger services continued to run right up until 1951, and it remained in use for goods traffic until 1962, after which point the track was lifted and the track bed was purchased by the County Council in 1972 and converted into the footpath we have today. So the line itself served 4 stations, the 2 at the termini, as well as Hertfordbury and Coal Green, as well as 2 halts further down. Nothing really exists of the halts in much substance these days, and I'm really only going to focus on Hertfordbury and Coal Green. Now, to find this route, we're starting off in Hertford, and to access the Coal Greenway, just find your way to Hertford Football Club, and you'll know that you're on the right route because you'll be confronted by these wonderful railway arches, which still stand today, carrying the railways into Hertford. And as you travel along it, you'll really get that idea of what the line does today, which is this really beautiful tree-lined path where you can almost imagine the single track bed leading these steam engines up and down the lines when they once were here. The first station that you'll encounter is Hertfordbury, one of the only 2 real survivors of the line. The station was used right up until 1962 when it was still gaslit, which gives you an idea of just how rural and underdeveloped the line really was. It's since been cut off from the path and converted into a private residence in 2016. So the platform is still there behind the wall, but the west end of the building has largely been demolished with an extension, so only really a tiny section of the house survives. It was featured in the 1936 film When Nights Were Bold, and also in the 2nd season of the children's TV programme Catweasel in 1970. If you were to diverge from the track and actually enter the village of Hertfordbury, you might well visit the Church of St Mary's. There is buried Jane Wenham, commonly believed to have been the last person sentenced to death for witchcraft in England in 1712. It's not true that she wasn't the last. She actually never was truly convicted, and she actually received a reprieve. Ended up living on the grounds of what is today Panshager Park, which is the local park around the area, which is home to one of the largest maiden oaks in the country, believed to have been planted by Queen Elizabeth herself, with its acorns being used to plant other oaks around the country by people like Prince Albert, Winston Churchill, and even the modern-day Queen herself. Approximately halfway along the track itself, you'll find the site of Coal Green Station. You can see what the station looked like in 1890. The building itself is no longer standing. Only the platforms survive. The buildings having been demolished in early 1975. It's been in the feature film The Lady with the Lamp in 1951. This is the location that Florence Nightingale gets off the train to head home. In the film, the carriages themselves were pulled by an early steam locomotive, 57 Lion, which dates back to 1838 for the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. And today we can see it preserved at the Museum of Liverpool. The engine itself was also used in the 1953 film Titfield Thunderbolt, which was in fact filmed on the Buntingford Railway, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. Today you can see the site of Coal Green Station. The 2 platforms are still in situ, but the down platform is largely overgrown and inaccessible. The up platform, although the station buildings are gone, today it's quite a convenient location to join the route, as there's a car park on site as well as a picnic site Further along, you'll see that there are these wooden poles that kind of mark out where the goods yard would have once have been and extended into, but nothing really survives. But it is a really nice place to join the route, to drive to this location. There's a pub really close by. You can have your picnic lunch and you can walk up and down the line from this location. So it does make for a really convenient place to go to. Travelling along further down the track, eventually you'll make your way towards the end of the line at Welwyn Garden City, and you'll be presented by these signs which tell you history about the line, and also it gives you a sort of a nice route of the line itself. Lists out the stations, and of course you can read a brief summary of the history that they have within them. I always like the fact that they have these information panels, because that way it allows people who might be unsuspectingly walking down these to remember that actually this is more than just simply a wonderful green corridor in connecting Welwyn Garden City to Hertford. Now, we eventually do end up at Welwyn Garden City, and that is where the Ayotte Greenway begins. Now, that was the Welwyn Garden City, Luton to Dunstable Railway, and it extends quite some distance, but today only the section between Ayotte Green and Wheathampstead is actually preserved as a public access route, and for that reason I'm only going to be focusing upon that part rather than the part that extends beyond Wheathampstead towards Harpenden and so on. But before I get on to that, I feel like I might well be a little bit amiss by not mentioning the Digswell Viaduct. Now, this is slightly north of Welwyn Garden City. It's styled to look like a Roman aqueduct by William Cubitt, who was the chief engineer of the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park. It opened in 1850 by Queen Victoria herself, and it carries the East Coast Main Line over the River Mimram. It's comprised of 40 arches of this wonderful red brick and is quite something to see. So if you're in the area, I always recommend definitely make the journey just a little bit more north from Welwyn Garden City and take a look at the Digswell Viaduct. To begin the route to find the Ayotte Greenway, you start at the White Bridge on Digswell Road. Now, the bridge itself dates back to approximately 1925, and there are many stories when this was part of the railway where children would run beneath the archway and brace themselves back against the wall as the passing trains would trundle through, or stand on the inside of the level crossings whilst the train zoomed past. Quite brave, I think. From the White Bridge, you follow the route through Sherrard's Park and eventually crossing the A1 into the town of Ayotte Green. Through the town you move, and eventually you'll find your way to the beginning of the Ayotte Green proper. It's unfortunately not a completely traffic-free route to get to the start, but you'll know you're at the start because, of course, it has a wonderful information panel telling you some brief history about the Ayotte Greenway. And you can see on the map here that I've drawn a brief idea of what that looks like, so you can see roughly where you're going. Now, when you enter the Ayotte Greenway, you're almost standing on the site of Ayotte Station itself. The line properly opened in 1877 and only actually lasted until 1949, with good services continuing until 1965. Refuse trains still used the line until 1971 to carry London's waste to the tip at Blackbridge until it was closed. Now, at the top of the stairs, unfortunately, you really don't have very many signs of Ayotte Station itself. The building burned down in 1948 and was never rebuilt, and the platforms and the site largely have been cleared away. Today, the A1 cuts through part of what would have been a section of the goods yard, and some of the remnants of old buildings, foundations, can be seen in the car park just behind the entrance to Ayotte Greenway. And it's possible, if you look over some of the hedges, that you might still be able to see the station master's house on the approach road, which today is a private residence. And the route itself continues along it's rather peaceful journey with only minor embankments to give you clues of what what it used to be used for. In some sections there are old bricks, some pieces of railway which have survived, such as old bridges, but not much of the line survives. What you really do get from this line is that true rural feel of what it must have been like to have travelled up and down the branch line. The line itself only ran for 6 days a week, as some of the local wealthy landowners didn't like the noisy trains disturbing them on their peaceful Sundays. And occasionally, those train drivers from the local area passing Luton Town football ground would occasionally actually stop the train, toot their whistles, and try to get the attention of the people there, just to get the latest scores. I think these stories are wonderful. They really give you that idea of just how rural these places are. I mean, imagine today, wanting to get the latest scores and just stopping your train and waiting for them to come along. I mean, it's maybe unthinkable nowadays, but different times, I think. Now, eventually, the route takes you through more of this beautiful countryside and ends just inside of Wheathampstead town itself. Not quite at the station, but it isn't too difficult to get to Wheathampstead station properly. Now, the station itself closed down in 1965, and today it's been opened up as a wonderful museum. 40 feet of open track have been laid down, with a wagon being placed upon them. There's a waiting shelter. Some of the original Victorian platforms have been preserved, and there's even a picnic spot placed just on the other side of the wagon that you can enjoy your lunch. This is all part of a wonderful volunteering project back in 2009 by local people to try to bring the station back to life. And you can see in one of the images there in the upper left, the station was largely overgrown, but through years of hard work, they opened it up, and today it's quite something to see. One of the famous passengers of the station was George Bernard Shaw, who lived only 4 miles away, and he would actually regularly cycle to the station to get into London. And sometimes, when he was running a bit late, the station master would hold the train, make sure that he arrived so that he would be able to get into London and store his bicycle away in the station master's house. And today there's a little statue of Shaw waiting patiently for the train. It's nice to be early, isn't it? It's nice to be early, but probably no trains coming. The Royal train also would have passed through Wheathampstead. It's on its way to Luton Hoo, so people like Queen Mother would have been heading on up there to spend time with their relatives. Now, Wheathampstead station did appear on a cover of a record sleeve for the band The Magic Lanterns for their single Shame, Shame. Now, the story goes that the photographer responsible for the shoot wanted to have the album cover take place on a disused station. And the one that he had chosen, he thought it was abandoned. And so he had this great idea of actually chaining each of the band members onto the track. So he started that process, chained them all up. But one of them, who was a train spotter, thought, hang on a minute, is it really abandoned? I don't think it is. And he kept his ear close to the ground, close to the track, to have a listen for any trains. And after a little bit of time, he did indeed hear a distant rumble. Now, although the photographer thought that was nonsense, he convinced all of them that there was a train coming. And sure enough, just after the last chain was removed, a diesel shunter with a few wagons in tow trundled on through. And so they moved the shoot to Wheathampstead instead. And as you can see from the cover, no tracks. So it's definitely abandoned. I mean, it's always a bit of a dead giveaway, isn't it? The rest of the line continues up to Harpenden, but because it's not a traffic-free route, I'm not going to continue the route. But if you are in Wheathampstead, I do recommend to have a look through this historic town. It dates back at least 1,000 years to the times of the Romans. There you can see old buildings from the 1500s, like this wheat mill. You can see the inn, where in the 17th century, Charles II was said to have stayed there during the Civil War. And if you travel along, you'll see St. Helen's Church, which goes back to at least the 13th century and has been used for Christian worship since at least that time. One of the things which I love about Wheat Hampstead is the fact that there's a great link with the first Roman visitation that this country had back in 54 BC, back when Julius Caesar tried to conquer the country. It's this location that it's said to have been the very first capital. And just outside of the outskirts of Wheat Hampstead, you'll find the Devil's Dyke. And this is where the local tribe actually made these great earthworks. And this is part of their ancient settlement that still survives today. Now, as you walk along this kind of route, you do get that idea of a little bit of history, a little bit of something familiar. And I, of course, mean railways, of course, because it has these really high embankments along it that you can walk along, as well as down in the centre, down through the actual trench itself as well. It's a really wonderful find there to be able to connect something that happened more than 2,000 years ago to something like railways, if you like to make that kind of connection. But it is well worth it. So if you find yourself in Wheat Hampstead, I always do like to recommend to have a look around the town itself. Now, the fourth location that I'm going to be talking about is the Alban Way, which is by far the line with the most surviving elements still in situ. The route itself connects St Albans to Hatfield. It was a branch of the Great Northern Railway opening up in 1865 and enabled people to be able to use the Great Northern at Hatfield. Now, many of the stations can still be seen preserved today. The line itself closed down in 1951 and during the 1960s to goods traffic. Today, the route has largely been replaced by buses, and it travels for about 6.5 miles and acts as this wonderful green wildlife corridor between these two urban areas. Now, starting at St Albans Abbey Station, you can reach the path from Holywell Hill, and that takes you over the top of the River Vere. Atop there, you'll find that you're actually standing atop a railway bridge. To get a better view, you can go down the stairs and you can kind of have a look at that railway bridge from afar. This panel, showing you the start of the location where that bridge is, close to St Albans Abbey, is showing you the overall route. But as we move further along, each of these panels will become very focused and only really focus on the section between stations themselves. It's the only line in this presentation which does this, and I think it makes for an extremely accessible and really interesting route through it. When you're on top of that bridge, of course, you can see a little bit of St Albans Cathedral. But of course, it's well signposted. Just by following these little circles with the Alban Way, the arrow, you'll find your way on the right track with no time to go. Not travelling too far, you'll find your way soon to the very first station, which is London Road. Now, the station here originally was the only station on the route. The subsequent stations leading up to Hatfield opened up afterwards. And today, the surrounding residential property makes up what would have been the goods yard, but the station itself still does survive along with the platform. Just today, it's a monkey puzzle day nursery. It's named after the London Road, which you can see in this image from 1954. There are two bridges heading off into the distance. So the London Road is the closest bridge to us. London Road is a road that dates back to the Roman times when St Albans was a major Roman city, and the route between the two places was highly important. Even today, its influence can be seen. It's changed its alignment many times throughout its history, but it's been in its present form since 1797, so it doesn't look like it's going to be changing anytime soon. Today, you'll see that it's home of graffiti artists as well as signposts which encourage you on going the right way, either to Hatfield or to St Albans, depending on your preference. Just beyond the arch is the other arch. That's the Midland Arch. Now, this originally once would have accommodated 4 track lines, and it supports the Midland Railway today, leading from Bedford to St Pancras above. This arch is only really visible thanks to fantastic works to clear all of the overgrowth away from the arch itself, and has only been really visible since 2015. It's quite magnificent, I have to admit, so if only you get to this far, it's well worth it in my view. Now, the route itself, as you can see, it looks longer than it is, but really it will probably only take you maybe just 10 to 15 minutes from the start of that bridge, where that first dot is, to the Midland Arch itself. The first station that we come to after is Salvation Army. Now, this is where in 1901 the Salvation Army moved its printing and musical businesses from Mile End in London, and it became a huge distribution centre for them, publishing works all across the world from this location. The platform itself that survives is actually constructed from sleepers, and as you can see, is pretty overgrown. A little bit further along, you can see that there is a blue bridge. That marks the point where a local man by the name of Frederick Sandler grew and exported exotic orchids for nearly 50 years to the rich and famous all around. And of course, just like the other ones, Salvation Army has this wonderful information panel which tells you this kind of information as well. Hill End Station was opened up in 1899, and that serviced the Hertfordshire County Mental Hospital. Today, said hospital was converted into housing in 1995, and only 3 of its original ward blocks survive. But from this station, you'd have been able to have actually set down a request to be let off. So it wouldn't have been a regular passenger service here, and it would have in fact had another siding which would have run south into the hospital and would have been responsible for delivering coal and other goods. Further down the line, we have ourselves Smallford Station, dating back to 1879. This was the last station closed in 1969 due to a contract with a scrap dealer who needed to use the platform for his own goods trade. Now today, the platform and the ticket office are still on site. There is a local residents association who work to renovate the station and to bring that history, not only of the station, but also of Smallford, back to life. And I really like, I think it's fantastic that these stations are bringing together communities to not only, develop the station and renovate it so that people can appreciate it today, but also can learn something more about this surrounding area itself. Travelling further along from Smallford, before we get to the next station, there are 2 things which really start to happen. There's a sculpture on the way, and this is something a bit unexpected, I think. It's called the Blackberry Arch. A local sculptor by the name of Diane McLean came up with the idea from the abundance of blackberry bushes which lined the path. She chose this location because on the route headed towards Hatfield is a lot more rural than it is towards St Albans. She made the arch at a blacksmith's forge and had it galvanised and etched. Now, each of these little leaves are beautifully silvery, and they stand out really wonderfully against the green. And today, local people have done a little bit of graffiti themselves, and they've written their names and messages on the leaves, which I understand the sculptor approves of. So I should imagine that perhaps more people will do that in the future. As you travel along the route, you'll eventually come across the abundance of signs. And there's one sign in particular which might catch your eye, which is this one. It says, "Look up, both up and down the line before you cross." But you're standing on a tarmac road, so there's no trains in theory coming. But nonetheless, I'm careful and I like to look both ways nonetheless. Upon looking both ways, you'll come across this sign. And this, as it says, in 1929, Ethel Violet Mason, aged just 18, died after she was hit by a passing train. And it asks you to remember her each time you pass through here. Now, this is a sad story. From reading the sign, you might well think this was an accident. In 1929, trains were not as speedy as they are today. This sign asks us to remember a suicide, sadly. This young girl had fallen pregnant by a married man in the local area, and unfortunately was at a point where she had no way out other than taking her own life. And I think that's incredibly poignant to mark that out. For sure, missed by some people who pass, and even if you read it without looking a bit more into it, it is easy to miss. And I think that's very important to not only take in what you're seeing, but also try to, after you come back home, look into it a little bit more, because you never know what you might find out about. But we're going to continue on. As you'll see, there are more signs further down the route. There's a nice sign for a train, isn't there? But it really marks the sign of the beginning of the ghost train trail. As you pass along, there are more and more signs which warn you of the trains which are coming. If you're brave enough, you'll eventually find your way to the best restored station on the route, which is Nast Hyde Halt. Nast Hyde Halt opened up in 1910 to serve the local community, and local folklore says that it's in fact specifically constructed for Oliver Bury, a local man who wanted a station close to his house in order to be able to commute to King's Cross. Now, the station itself only opened up in 2019 after a 4-year restoration project inspired by the work done at Wheat Hampstead, and it looks amazing in my view. The site itself, the platform, the wonderful flower arrangements and bushes on the milk jugs, the posters, the signs, it's truly wonderful. It's truly wonderful, but I really love the fact that they're constantly reminding us to beware of the trains. Beware of the trains. Please, please take care when you're on the line. I like this a lot. Now, of course, it does take you through into Hatfield. The signs, they change a little bit once you're in Hatfield itself. And drawing closer to to Hatfield station, it doesn't end directly on the station, but very close to the tracks. And you can see on this map just roughly where the actual railway comes in and where the Alban Way ends or starts if you want to start in Hatfield. So you kind of get that idea of where the railway would have turned and looped into the railway proper today. If you are going to Hatfield, a beautiful town to go to for sure, it's well worth to have a look behind Hatfield station, just where this point is, and have a look at the Park Street Bridge. Incredibly beautiful place. I think missed by some people visiting Hatfield. It takes us into Hatfield Old Town, which is a treat in and of itself. Quite hilly, so I definitely make sure you bring your bottles of water if you're going to be walking up these hills. But you do get a lovely sight of some parts of Hatfield House, which date back to the time of when Queen Elizabeth I lived here when she was a child. It's said, of course, that Queen Elizabeth was in fact told that her sister Mary had died and that she would in fact be queen on the grounds of Hatfield House, at the site of an oak tree, no less. But is that true or not? Well, who knows? But that's a nice story. Now, our penultimate line is the Nicky line. Now, the Nicky line itself takes us from Harpenden Station all the way to Hemel Hempstead, and really the link itself served as a means to provide the straw plate trade in Hemel to the hat makers in Luton, as well as providing a passenger service at Harpenden, allowing people to reach London. The line was proposed in 1862, but it didn't open until 1877 due to a lot of land disputes. Unfortunately, by 1886, the straw plate trade had declined, and the line never really saw much intensive use. Ultimately, it closed down to passengers in 1947 and goods trains in 1979. The Nicky line is well signposted, just like all of them, but it starts just a little bit north of Harpenden station itself. These signs, much like the ones on the Ayotte and the Coal Greenway, tell us a little bit of that information about the Nicky line itself, its course, its route, and some of the fun facts about it. One of the lovely things about it is that it's the only line which has got these railway signs with the name of the line within them. I know that the Alban Way does, but this one is an actual sign popped into the wall itself, which I think is a lovely feature. To start the line, once you've located the beginning, you head on down these stairs. And there you'll be confronted by what the line is today. Much like the others, it's a wonderful track bed with surrounding trees upon its embankments. One of the things about the Nicky line that is shrouded in mystery is its name. Why on earth is it called the Nicky line? Now, in truth, nobody really knows. Some people suggest that it's because of the link between Hertfordshire and Nicholas Breakspere, who was the first and only English pope back in the 12th century. Some people suggest that it's to do with the type of trousers that navvies wore when constructing the line, these kind of knickerbockers, these kind of puffed out trousers. But in reality, we don't really know why it's called the Nicky line. Some people call it something different. Some people call it the Puffing Annie line. And that's because some parts of the railway do have quite steep gradients, and for the old steam engines of the time it would create a lot of smoke, a lot of steam on their ascents, and so these engines were referred to as Puffing Annies, and some people call it the Puffing Annie line, whatever you prefer, you know. The first station that you encounter is Roundwood Halt. It's one of the few stations that actually you can really see any sign of. You can see that there is the platform itself still stands there, and just on the other side of the platform is a quadrant signal which still stands there. Now, it would have catered for the housing development in Harpenden during its expansion in the 1920s, and as you travel along the line itself, you'll eventually find these wonderful sleepers. They're normally found at a point where there was a crossing, such as these ones, which mark out Townsend Lane crossing. And from here on, the route doesn't, strictly speaking, follow the route of the actual railway. It's the railway is a little bit on top of the embankment, but the route curves around it, so that I don't think it makes it too extreme. You could probably walk the embankment section, but then you'd be walking through thick undergrowth. The route itself does cross multiple roads to get down to almost its halfway point at Redbourne. Redbourne station largely gone. The buildings themselves long disappeared. But a bit like some of the other ones, you can find some scattered bricks, telegraph poles hidden in trees, some ironwork across the ground beside you. You just have to look really carefully to find the remnants on your route, so keep an eye out. Crossing these roads, you do find yourself crossing a number of the bridges which the railway would have crossed, and either travelling down or up a certain gradient to get to the next location. Eventually you'll find yourself crossing the M1 via this tunnel. Now, you'll always know where you are because the Nicky line has got these signs along it which mark out roughly where you've been and where you're going. Once you reach the tunnel, you know that you're approximately halfway along the route. And I really like these signs that appear. It's the only one that has a dedicated sign to what the Nicky line is today, a green corridor through Hertfordshire. And the views that you get from when the trees part and you can see across the fields and you can see for miles are breathtaking. Absolutely incredible, especially on a summer's day. Now, once you've passed through the tunnel itself, you find yourself at Beaumont's Halt. Nothing really survives there except for Cherry Tree Lane Bridge and a 1 in 4-2 gradient post. The post itself has been restored, but from this point onwards, you get that idea of just how steep it's going to be. Even if you don't know what this post is suggesting, you can have an idea that the path is going to get a lot steeper than this. Here we are sort of looking back. We're kind of looking back the same route, and I hope you can get an idea of how this looked. Believe me, it is more steep than it looks even in the photo. Either that or I'm just really unfit. I don't know. Unfortunately, there's nothing that really survives beyond apart from the bridge of Beaumont's Halt. At the summit, you'll find yourself at Godwin's Halt. No station survives there either, unfortunately. But at the summit, that would have been a place where the trains would have gone with the London sweepings. The sweepings themselves were road sweepings of animal dung. These were used as fertiliser by the local farmers. The line itself eventually reaches the outskirts of Hemel Hempstead, and a lot of the line has been built over by residential properties, industrial estates, parks, but some of it is still visible, and eventually you find yourself towards the end of it. You know you're at the end of the line because once you reach the end, and this sign doesn't go on any further, on the main road you'll see there's the Midland Hotel. The Midland Hotel itself once would have served the actual station of Hemel Hempstead, which used to stand just across from it today. Nowadays, it's just a busy road. In fact, actually, where the line ends is in fact a railway bridge, but it's been completely filled in today. The line beyond this extends only really kind of almost in our imagination. You can follow it, it's possible, but it's quite tricky. I've drawn a rough map as to where approximately it goes. Essentially, the next stop for it would have been where today Hemel Hempstead Hospital is, and eventually it would have crossed the Grand Union Canal and connected up to Hemel Hempstead Station as it is today, or Boxmoor as it would have been back in the 20th century. Now, the line itself, although some of the lines might have been famous for their films, this line has been famous for its experimentation. And I love this fact. I love the fact that this has been used for these two types of vehicles. First of all, it was used for a prototype type of hybrid railway vehicle, a row railer. This is the LMS Carrier. This was used in the early 1930s. It was both a road and rail vehicle. So when you're looking at the photograph, you can see this is obviously a coach or a bus, if you like. It's on the tracks, and there in the upper picture, it's on the road. It's actually sitting in the upper image on one of these sleepered crossings, and this would be used to actually switch it between rail to road transportation in a matter of under 5 minutes, just by one person flipping a nice switch or lever. Ultimately, it was unsuccessful, as you might have guessed. Otherwise, they would be commonplace, I guess. This thing was transferred up to Stratford-upon-Avon in 1932 for use of the Welcome Hotel, and it shuttled passengers between Stratford Old Town Station and the hotel. Good idea. Unfortunately, the extreme vibrations, the mechanical problems, and the general lack of passengers meant that it wasn't in service for too long. The other vehicle that the line tested was the rail motor. This is a lightweight train with an integrated motor within it. Now, the image here isn't of the one that would have been used on the Nicky line. This is taken from the Didcot Railway Centre, where, if you're interested, of course, you can go there and you can see rail motors in situ. Now, the Nicky line itself has got a Friends programme. It does have a Friends of the Nicky line organisation. So if you're from the local area and you're interested in the continued preservation of the line, as well as other events associated with it, it's well worth to take a look at. Our sixth and final line is the Ebury Way. It's the shortest of all of them. It's only 3.5 miles out of a proposed 6, as an extension from Rickmansworth to Uxbridge by Lord Ebury, whose house at Moor Park is pretty close to Rickmansworth Station, and he's normally credited for the creation of the line. It opened up in 1862, but with competition from another railway, one a little bit more famous, called the Metropolitan Railway. More people started to use that one to travel to the sort of the real outskirts right there. This is the only line which was electrified in 1927 from the ones that I've mentioned, and ultimately it closed down in 1951 due to general underuse. Good services ended in 1981. Today, it'll probably take you about 30 minutes to cycle the whole thing if you are in that kind of mood. And ultimately, I'm going to leave the rest of this line as a little bit of a mystery, a little bit of a tantalizing glimpse at it, and hopes that you might well be interested in visiting it yourself. If you do, and this goes for all of them, it is always a good idea to remember that these lines are seen completely differently if you go at night time, where they take on a rather creepy and eerie feel, especially if you do not have a high-powered torch like I did on my journeys here. And of course, another thing to remember is that if you do go at night time, other than remaining safe and with people that you obviously trust, it's a fantastic place for stargazing. You get some wonderful views of the night sky, and here on the Ebury Way you can also see the Metropolitan Railway whizzing past in this wonderful orangey glow. If you're lucky, you might even find traces of some parts of the railway which still survive today. Well, I want to thank everybody for listening, and I really want to hear your experiences. So write them down in the comments below and let me know what your experiences are, whether you've travelled on these routes yourselves, when maybe they were open or when they've been closed, or maybe if it inspires you to go off and do it in the future. Whatever you do, wherever you go, just remember to watch out for the ghost trains themselves. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Much as we've enjoyed your London walks, it's a nice change to get out into the countryside beyond. I guess it's sad in a way that the tracks you've shown us in Hertfordshire are no longer served by trains, but it's great to see how they've been given an alternative and practical use as green walking and cycleways. So thank you, Paul, for all your research, not only into the railway history, but also into the stories and the events that are all part of the line's heritage. Hopefully the presentation will encourage some of our viewers to don their walking boots or cycling gear and visit the lines for real. And of course, we look forward to joining you on a live guided walk as soon as we can. Finally, thanks to everyone for watching. If you're not already a member of the Friends, please do consider joining us. The details are on screen. Taking out Friends membership is a great way of supporting the museum as it looks to reopen, hopefully on the 17th of May. Join us again soon for another of our at-home presentations.